In 1953, this country had nothing. No factories, no roads worth driving on, no electricity in most homes. Its economy was poorer than North Korea, poorer than most nations in Africa. Western economists studied it and wrote it off completely. One World Bank report from that era didn't even bother forecasting its future because there wasn't one worth predicting. 70 years later, that same country builds more semiconductors than any nation on Earth. Its pop culture fills stadiums in Los Angeles, London, and Sao Paulo. Its companies, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, are inside your home right now. This is the story of South Korea. And it's not a story about luck. It's a story about brutal decisions, painful sacrifice, and a bet so risky it could have destroyed the country entirely. To understand how Korea rose, you first have to understand how far it fell. For 35 years, Korea wasn't even its own country. Japan had occupied it, stripped its resources, banned its language, and erased its identity. When Japan finally withdrew in 1945, Korea didn't get freedom. It got division. The Soviets took the north. The Americans took the south. A line was drawn at the 38th parallel, and it was never meant to be permanent. It became permanent anyway. In 1950, the north invaded the south. What followed was 3 years of a war so devastating that nearly every major city was flattened. Estimates suggest close to 3 million Koreans died, soldiers and civilians combined. Families were split in half, some forever. By the time the armistice was signed in 1953, South Korea's per capita income was around 67 US dollars a year, lower than Ghana, lower than Sudan. There was no industry to speak of, no natural resources worth exporting, just a battered, divided peninsula and a population trying to survive. If you had asked any economist in 1953 which Asian country would become a global powerhouse, none of them would have said South Korea. In 1961, a general named Park Chung-hee seized power in a coup. History has judged him in two very different ways, as an authoritarian ruler who crushed political dissent and as the architect of Korea's economic transformation. Both are true at once. Park made a decision that would define the next 3 decades. South Korea would not wait for foreign aid to lift it up. It would industrialize by force, using state power to pick winners and push them onto the world stage. This is where the chaebols were born, massive family-run business conglomerates, hand-picked and heavily supported by the government. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Daewoo. These weren't scrappy startups that rose organically. They were selected, funded with cheap government loans, and pressured, sometimes brutally, to hit export targets or lose government support entirely. The government didn't just help business, it told business what to build. Textiles first because Korea had cheap labor and needed quick export revenue. Then steel because Park believed, against nearly every advisor's objection, that a poor agrarian nation could build a modern steel industry from scratch. In 1968, construction began on the Pohang steel plant. Critics called it a fantasy project. Today, PISCO is one of the largest steel producers on the planet. Then came shipbuilding, then automobiles, then electronics. Each leap looked impossible at the time it was made. The human cost of this strategy was enormous. Workers, many of them women in textile factories, worked brutal hours for minimal pay. Labor unions were suppressed. Political opposition was jailed. This wasn't a fairy tale of a benevolent government lifting up its people. It was an authoritarian state extracting extraordinary sacrifice from its citizens in exchange for a promised future. By the late 1970s, that promise was starting to look real. Korea's economy was growing at rates the West hadn't seen outside of post-war reconstruction. Economists began calling it the miracle on the Han River. But the story wasn't finished. In fact, its hardest test hadn't even come yet. By the 1990s, South Korea looked unstoppable. Then, in 1997, it nearly lost everything. The Asian financial crisis hit the region like a wave, and Korea's chaebols, the very companies that built the miracle, turned out to be dangerously over-leveraged. They had borrowed enormous sums in foreign currency, betting on endless growth. When the currency collapsed, that debt became catastrophic. The Korean won lost nearly half its value in weeks. Major conglomerates, including parts of Daewoo, collapsed entirely. Unemployment tripled almost overnight. Korea had to do something almost unthinkable for a proud, newly industrialized nation. It went to the International Monetary Fund, hat in hand, for a $58 billion bailout, one of the largest in history at the time. But what happened next revealed something about the Korean national character that outsiders hadn't fully understood. Ordinary citizens began voluntarily donating their household gold, wedding rings, children's gold necklaces, family heirlooms, to help the country pay down its debt. Over 200 tons of gold were collected in a matter of weeks. It wasn't just a financial recovery, it was a demonstration of collective will. The government forced the chaebols to restructure, cut debt, and become more transparent. Many companies that had been protected for decades were suddenly forced to compete on merit for the first time. It was painful, but it made Samsung, LG, and Hyundai leaner, sharper, and far more competitive on the global stage than they had ever been before. Korea repaid its entire IMF loan nearly 3 years ahead of schedule. Here's where the story takes a turn nobody predicted, not even the Koreans themselves. While Samsung was becoming the world's largest smartphone and memory chip maker, and Hyundai was rolling cars into showrooms across 5 continents, the Korean government made another calculated bet. Culture could be exported just like steel or semiconductors. In the late 1990s, following the financial crisis, the government began actively funding the entertainment and creative industries, a strategic pivot as deliberate as the chaebol strategy decades earlier. This is the origin of what the world now calls the Korean wave, or Hallyu. At first it was Korean dramas spreading through Asia. Then it was Psy's Gangnam Style becoming the first YouTube video to hit 1 billion views. Then it was BTS selling out stadiums in London and Los Angeles, addressing the United Nations, and becoming one of the highest earning music acts on the planet. Then it was Parasite winning the Academy Award for Best Picture, the first non-English film in history to do so. Then Squid Game became Netflix's most watched series ever in any language. This wasn't an accident. It was the same national playbook that built Samsung. Identify an industry with global potential, invest heavily, remove obstacles, and push relentlessly until Korean products dominate global markets. Except this time, the product wasn't steel or ships. It was culture itself. Today, Korean beauty products, Korean fashion, Korean food, and Korean language classes are booming across the very countries. America, Britain, France, that once viewed Korea as a poor, war-torn afterthought. So how did a country with $67 in per capita income become one with a GDP exceeding $1.7 trillion in less than 3 generations? The honest answer isn't inspiring in a simple way. It wasn't just hard work, and it wasn't just luck. It was a series of ruthless, high-risk state decisions. Decisions that came with real human cost, suppressed freedoms, and painful sacrifice. It was a near-total collapse in 1997 that forced brutal but necessary reform. And it was a willingness, again and again, to bet everything on industries that looked impossible at the time. Steel in a farming nation, semiconductors in a country with no tech base, pop music in a market dominated by Western labels. South Korea's transformation is often called a miracle, but miracles don't require decisions. This did. It required a nation to decide repeatedly across 70 years that where it started would not determine where it ended up. The next time you unlock a Samsung phone, drive a Hyundai, or find yourself humming a K-pop song you didn't expect to like, remember what that country looked like in 1953? Because if South Korea can go from the ashes of war to the center of global culture and technology in one lifetime, the story of what's possible for any nation, any company, or any person starting from nothing might be closer to reality than we think. If you enjoyed this story, there are many more empires waiting to be uncovered. The people, companies, and countries that rose to power and the ones that fell from it. Subscribe to Beyond the Empire and let's go beyond the headlines together. See you in the next story.